And welcome to episode 76 of Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres. I can see there's already people here who seem to have been getting in here in advance looking at the comments. So welcome, I'll get to you in a sec. Just to set you up and let you know what's coming up first. Tonight we're going to be talking about shadows. Now, in essence, there's two different kinds of... I've decided to sort of split this as such. There's the notion of shadows as in like shadows that fall on your face and you're emerging from the shadows. And then there's shadows which are cast by something. So you hold something up to the light and shadow then falls on another surface. And it's this second kind of shadow that we're going to be talking about. And this is in advance of next week. I'm going to set a shadow cast challenge for you, but more about that in a little while. Once I've talked about, I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and then the second part is going to be the critique section. Now, we've actually had quite a bit in the way of critique. It's a strange one. Quite often with critique, I can sometimes struggle. We get one or two people put something in. This time we've got about 7, 8, 9 possibly. I think a couple of people have even put more than one image in. So, notion of shadows, we'll come back to that. Anne has put in this photo while she was on a big trip. Her and Robert were away, and she's looking for a little bit of feedback on editing and shade and a general sense of this photo. Garry was after this. Well, he's taken this photo. He's quite happy. He likes the way the shadow essentially falls on the parasol, but the guy in the bright jacket behind he feels is distracting, wondering what he might be able to do about that. Jack, welcome Jack. Jack's first submission to the podcast has been putting in this sort of dried flower head, which as autumn comes on, he's wanting for a bit of feedback about that, so we'll be talking about that later. Jim has been out of Port Patrick editing a photo. He replaced the sky, but isn't entirely sure whether it works or not, looking for a little bit of feedback on there, so we'll be talking about that as well. Nurije set up a photo, got this little heart from her mother-in-law, life is like a camera. Now, she did a couple of versions of this, did a colour version and a black and white version, and is looking to try and get a sense of which one of those works best. Robert, while down in Colorado, looked over the side of a bridge and saw a shopping trolley or shopping cart sitting in the water. Couldn't resist it and decided to take a photo of that, but is also looking for little bits of feedback of what he might have done differently. And Rosemary has some little owlets have been gathering. She's been managing to take some photos, but has been struggling with the green cast on the feathers. Now, whilst you would naturally get a kind of green cast in when it's light's coming through the trees, she feels it's kind of too green. I was wondering if there's a way of sort of balancing that up. So we're going to be talking a little bit later about white balance. Vandana has been busy with taking a photo of a sunrise and, or was it a sunset? I can't remember. I've got the notes. We'll come back to that. Wondering if she could have cropped this or done something different with the photo. And actually, I just realised I forgot to include in this. We have Viji sent through a pair of flip-flops with a bit of a story behind that, and wondering if she's managed to capture the story. So we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. So an awful lot to come up with that. So here we are right now, live on YouTube, live and unscripted as always. So I can see that we have a few people in already. If you're here, if you're watching, leave me a comment. Let me know you're here if you haven't done so already. If this is your first time here, let me know where you're from as well. It's always really interesting to know where in the country or where in the world people are tuning in from. If you haven't done already, make sure you subscribe. Somewhere down here underneath your screen there should be a subscription and a little click the bell for notifications to make sure that you find out in the future as and when these things come out. And of course, if you find these podcasts useful, interesting, entertaining, and you would like to support them in some ways, as well as telling all your friends about them, then buymeacoffee.com/Kim Ayres is always a place you can do that. So you can see there I've got a few comments in, even as I was kind of kick-starting on this, there was a good half a dozen comments. So Jack is here, says, hi everyone, way too early, but Pat was straight in. Hi Jack, me too, from an overcast Somerset. Jack saying it's sunny in Wisconsin. Garry says hello from the Peak District. Jim saying hi everybody from Dumfries. Rosemary is saying greetings to all from the sunny Pacific Northwest. Then Jackie's here from South Africa. Meg, my daughter, from downstairs is also in. Maggie, my wife, from the room next door, is saying hello everyone. Nurije is saying hi everyone from Exmouth. Ben is in from Edinburgh. John is here from Ohio. Vandana is saying hello. I think Vandana's London way. Brian's saying hi from a dry Dumfries. And Robert is here from Texas. Okay, somebody's lost the connection. Nuria's lost the connection, wondering if anybody else has got that problem, but other people are saying no, they're fine. Oh, Rosie's here from Whithorn, and yeah, brilliant. Okay, and then there's little bits of chat going backwards and forwards from Pat, who likes the owlets, and a sense of whether people have still got the connection or not. Certainly here on my little kind of the studio screen setup feedback that I've got here, it currently says excellent connection, which is nice to know. How long it lasts, who knows? But while it's working, let's make the most of it. So, wonderful. Welcome. Hello. Thank you for all turning up. Right, so let's talk about shadows then. So shadows are one of these things. Like I say, there's different kinds. There's shadows. Shadows are caused by light, and they are the absence of light. It's where light is shining onto a surface, but the shadow is where something is blocking that light from showing. So it is darker. Now, a couple of months back, we talked about silhouettes, where essentially the whole subject or object that we are looking at is in the shadow of itself. You're not seeing any part of it. The light is behind it, so we can't make any of the detail out on it. Now, unlike a silhouette, which actually has you're looking at the actual outline of the object itself. A shadow, at least the kind of shadows we're talking about today, is cast. It's on a different surface to the object. And as such, that tends to distort and change. Now, we've been using that notion we've been using shadows for centuries. Certainly you've only got to think of sundials as a way of telling the time. As the sun moves around the sky, the shadow moves around as well. And people started to realise, our ancestors from a long way back realised that it was happening regularly. You could make marks in the ground or marks on a piece of stone, and you could put a stick, and where the shadow fell, it would fall at that same time every day. But then also, depending on whether the sun is higher in the sky or lower in the sky, that shadow is longer or shorter. And this is part of the amazing thing about shadows, is that they change and they distort. So the thing is then, is that means we can kind of have a bit of fun with them. So, for example, there's also, again, ancestors go back thousands of years. There's been the notion of shadow puppets, where you have a screen and you have a light behind and you cast the shadows onto the screen. Or hand puppets. From the youngest age, it's just kind of, hopefully you can kind of sort of see a dot of light over here. Now, I remember learning, let's try and get this shape here. Something like this, which gives a little mouth and an eye and ears. And that was the first shape I learnt. And then there are all sorts of other ones, bunny rabbits, and then you can use two to create elephants and birds. And it can be incredibly complex and beautiful what people can do with just shaping their hands. A bit like origami, you're always amazed that little bits of paper can suddenly look like a unicorn. So I don't know whether anybody's got any amazing kind of hand shadows. If you have a particularly fancy one, put it into the Facebook group. And for those anybody who's watching here live on or recorded on YouTube, there is also the notion that we have Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres. There is a Facebook group. Type that into Facebook. You will find it if you happen to do Facebook. And that's a place where you can submit images, where you can chat with other people, put in questions. If you don't do Facebook, but you still want to submit images, ask questions, then just email me. You can see my website here is kimayres.co.uk. Just put Kim at kimayres.co.uk and you'll be able to send me your messages, your questions and your images for the podcast. So back then to this notion of shadows and playing with them. So hand puppets, sundials, this kind of thing. But there is that notion of it being a distortion. Now you can't, sometimes you can make, well, let me backtrack a little bit. One of the things I talked about with silhouettes is, I remember a few months ago, was that notion that when you see a silhouette, you can't help but try and fill in the details. It's sort of evolutionary wise, we've been, you know, our brains have evolved to fill in the gaps, to try and make sense of the missing bits. And because the ancestors of ours that could work out what something was likely to be, even though they couldn't see all of it, it was the difference between those who managed to find something to eat or those who got eaten by whether you were a hunter or whether you were prey. So our ancestors, the ones who got eaten, didn't become our ancestors. They didn't pass on that genetic line. So we've genetically evolved to try and be curious about silhouettes and shapes where we try and fill in the pattern. Shadows become kind of interesting because, like I say, there's an extra level of distortion where so that something that looks like a hand can suddenly maybe look like a dog or a creature when it's cast. I mean, let's go. Let me throw a couple of pictures up just to sort of start playing and give you some kind of idea. So here we have a shadow, and you know, for those who have looked at some of the pictures, or rather those of you who've already looked at the photo I was using to promote tonight's podcast, you'll already know what the other half of this is. But I wanted to put this up just to show that if you're looking at the shadow, it's not necessarily that easy to know what it is what it is that's actually casting that shadow. There could be a whole bunch of explanations. However, put in the rest of the photo, we can now see this is Jessica throwing her hair back. And this was very deliberately done, this particular shoot, where I used a single light source precisely so it would cast a hard single shadow. If you have multiple light sources, then shadows get softened and they get filled in by the other light sources. So if you're wanting to cast a strong shadow, the first thing to remember is you need a single light source that's stronger than any other lighting source around you. And that might be the sun, it might be a flash, it might be a torch. So as you can see here, I think that kind of becomes interesting. This was another shot, same kind of setup, but taken straight on. The thing is that the shadow in this case is falling off at a different line, so it's creating different lines. I mean, when we go back to this, one of the things I always love about this photo is that sense that you get the sort of V kind of shape with it. The diagonals become so much more strong in this one. And then because you've got a curve here on the edge of the light source as well, you've got a diagonal curves up here, curves down here, curves up there, shoots out the corner. And these kind of diagonals really add a sense of energy and dynamism to it. This one's slightly different. You have a sort of partial diagonal of the shadow, although here everything's rooted much more in the vertical, and it has a sort of different kind of feel to it, even though it's more or less the same kind of photo taken from a different angle. So understand then that when you're photographing, the angle you're at is also going to have an impact. So other things where you get a direct casting. I remember when I went to Morocco a few years back, and I did the camel ride in the desert bit. Very touristy thing to do, but oh wow, what an experience. And when you're on the back of a camel, that's very difficult because you are kind of literally bouncing about all over the place. Difficult to hold your camera steady. And also you tend to be holding on for dear life using both hands. So it was a bit perilous taking one hand off, having a fast shutter speed on the camera, and then trying to take photos while on the back of the camel. But of course, if you can do that, the absolutely irresistible one you have to do is the picture of your shadow. And you can see here how the shadow gets distorted. Because there's a slope going down before the sand dune starts running up, the length of the legs in the shadow of these camels, everything gets kind of really distorted. In this one here, we've not got that. We're just kind of on the ridge. The shadows are slightly longer than natural. The sun hasn't reached that 45-degree angle yet where the shadow length would be the same as the actual length. So it's still a bit lower. It's still fairly early. It's in the morning. But you've got that kind of ridge, the shadows on the ridge. So we can see people on camels being led by someone. And in this one, you've got the length here. And actually down in the bottom corner, you can actually see the camel's leg on this and the shadow starting to come off it. And you can trace that back leg straight down to here. So there's a fun thing sometimes to decide, do you want to include the subject as well as the shadow, or do you just want to have the shadow in its own right? So something to think about, because like I say, at the end of this, what we're going to do for next week, I'm going to be setting the shadow challenge. So I'm hoping that when you're listening to this, it's starting to put down a few ideas. You know, you might want to watch this back, grab a notepad and pen, open a little file on your computer or your tablet or your phone and tap down ideas as they occur to you. Here's another one where the shadows of the blinds are then falling on a person. So this is the person themselves, I suppose, is the subject of this. The subject isn't the blinds, but the blinds are having a profound effect on the picture. So that kind of changes things as well. So think about the way shadows are falling on a surface, and in this case, the surface happens to be a person. Now, what I wanted to show you here was these completely unedited, quick photos taken last night. Large sketchbook open, just so I could have a white surface. So here's a kitchen whisk. I just want to show you something, and then I'm using the torch, shining it straight down on top of the whisk. What I want to show you here is the difference of what happens is when you then move the light source. So here the light is pointing straight down. Then I started to move it round slightly, and you can see that the shadow starts to move across. I move it round further. The shadows are now really interfering to a point whereby, if you didn't already know what the whisk looked like from the previous photos, you have to really start interpreting what it was you were seeing, because the thin lines of the whisk and the lines of the shadows are now kind of all overlapping and interfering with each other. Stretch it out further, and now taking it down much, near horizontal, and we're getting some really kind of even the thin bits of metal from the whisk are creating wider, thicker shadows. Bits are becoming really distorted. And to take it further, and then it's being cast more accurately on the back wall of here, but where it's stretching out, we've got bits which are really kind of faded and stretched and warped and everything else. And so you can end up with some really quite strange shapes just from a simple kitchen implement. Let's take it even simpler. Let's get a fork. Let's get 3 forks. Get 3 forks, and you just, again, this one's here, you're leaning them straight on. There's a little kink at the bottom here where it goes straight and then curves up onto the wall. But then as I sort of move the light source round to the side a bit, take it round further, and you can see how the shadows are now really starting to pull out to one side. They're starting to distort. We're getting, rather than it being like here where it feels like the forks are leaning and the shadows are straight, by the time you get to this, it's almost like an arch. Like we've got triangles that it's almost like the forks are actually leaning into each other, and it feels, if you're just looking at the shadow, if you hadn't noticed the edge of the page over on the left here, it could almost be like the shadows were leaning in as much as, so it seems very triangular at this point. Here we take it further, and now you notice the forks, suddenly forgotten the word, anyway, the pointy bits on the forks. Somebody can tell me. You can see how they are getting stretched out now, and that the actual handles of the forks are then becoming much shorter. Change it again, you now shoot from underneath, and now prongs, there we go, there's a word, prongs of the forks are now almost disappeared, because the curve of the sort of spoon part of the fork is now dominating that round bit there. So you can see then how that just by changing the angle of your light source, you're dramatically changing what the forks look like, and thus you're changing that kind of interaction, the mood, the feel, the lines, the shape, the composition, and even the story of what it is you're doing by changing the angle of the light source. And this is part of what I wanted to do. Those of you who've been watching these podcasts for any length of time know that I'm often talking about the story, the narrative of the photo, and the importance of it. You're trying to convey something to the viewer, some mood, some idea, some concept, some thought. It doesn't have to be war and peace, it can be very simple, but you're still trying to convey something across. But you can change that narrative, and very often you can change that narrative by changing the light source or changing the angle of the light. Let's try something else here, a glass. Glass is always fun here, because glasses, because they are round, the thickness varies. Even though it sort of might be uniform, when the light is passing through it, there's less light, there's less thickness of glass for the light to pass through the middle, but the edges, there's a lot of thickness for the light to pass through. So what we find here is that there's a deeper shadow on the edges and it's lighter in the middle. But because the glass is warped slightly, it means that you get all these kind of bits where light is coming in, refracting out, overlapping the shadows. You can get some really weird and wonderful kind of shapes that come out just from a standard tumbler. Put it over on the bottom, and now the light going through the base is then again casting really strange, wonderful shapes. And then we're getting little refractions coming up on top here, light bursting all over the place. So refracting glass can be really quite interesting. Again, here we turn it upside down. I mean, to me, that almost looks like an X-ray. It's got that same kind of feel to it. Let's just try something here a moment. Let's flip back for a moment. So I've got my glass of water here. What happens if yeah, there we go. You hopefully see that, enough of that. Because I've got water in it now, you can see little light refraction. You're not getting a straightforward shadow. It kind of, the light and shadow refracts all over the place. So that's fun. That's certainly something worth playing with. And then also, the other thing worth playing with is, of course, colour. So here we have a purple tumbler. Because it's purple glass, it then casts a purple shadow. So you can have fun with this idea of glass and shadows and what the shadows will cast. And even if you've got some kind of perspex, coloured glass or things like that, you can even mix and match and play around with things. In this case, I then put the purple tumbler straight on top of the white one and pointed the light straight down, and we end up with some pretty amazing patterns down at the bottom. In fact, it almost looks like this is sort of hovering above some kind of vortex or whirlpool. You're not really seeing the shadow under the glass in the way you would expect to. So it looks more like it's hovering above it, and I've cut it out and pasted it on. But I guarantee you, that's just straight out of the camera, no adjustments, no edits. This is another one. Here's another way, which are now anybody who's ever been into any of these online competitions like Guru Shots, Photo Crowd, ViewBug, and the like. Whenever there's a shadows competition, somebody nearly always does this. And this here, that's my wedding ring. Very often it's placed in a Bible or some kind of holy book or something like this. This just happens to be a closest photography book that I could grab at the time. But the point being that you can create a story by, so that we know the ring is round, but because of the curvature of the paper, the shadow it casts is heart-shaped. And because it's heart-shaped, it's the perfect kind of wedding type photo, wedding engagement photos and things like that. So understand that you can play around with the shadow and light that way. And obviously we've got the light source behind the, in order to cast a shadow so that's falling towards us. So this is, I think that this idea is really exciting to play around with shadows. How can you take shadows and how will they change depending on where the light source is coming from? Another one to play with. Here's some drawing pins or thumbtacks. Straightforwardly, I've got 5 of them put down. 2 of them are flat pointing up. 3 of them are just lying around. But look at the different shadows they cast. Now, the torch is just down at same level. I'm looking straight down from above. And so if you wanted, you could start mixing and matching and creating different shapes so that the shadow, you could create something quite different in the shadows to what's actually being created, or to what the source material is. If you didn't see, if we zoomed in a bit here and just did that, you wouldn't necessarily have any idea that it was drawing pins, thumbtacks that were causing those shadows. So herein lies the fun, I think. Now, one other thing I just wanted to point out, which is, 2 other things actually. No, 3 other things. Right, okay, I didn't realise that. A version of something. Now, I've only got a 4-pronged fork here. Really need a 5-pronged one. And maybe I should have edited this to make this a little bit clearer. But I saw one of these things done where somebody's essentially drawn musical notes onto... So the shadow is acting a bit like a stave, a kind of sort of musical sheet as such, and then you can sort of draw notes on it and stuff like that. So that notion then of interacting shadows with even drawings, and other forms of creativity means that you can really have a bit of fun in with that as well. Now, something else to point out as well. Just now when I was talking about the notion of how light refracts through glass, sometimes that can become interesting in shadows in their own right. I remember taking this photo several years ago when I was sitting at the kitchen table reading a book. The sun was really low in the sky, just coming in through the window, casting a shadow on the wall. And I noticed this streak of light running through the middle of my eyes here. And I suddenly realised it's the glasses. And as the light came into the glasses, it was refracting and creating this particular streak right through there. And I thought, that's really quite cool. I like that. So you can see the shadow. So we've got the shadow, and we can see here a face reading the book. Got some flowers being lit up in the foreground. But that little extra streak of light, refracted light running through the shadow, I just thought was rather cool. So you can look out for things like that, ways to play with the shadow and play with light within the shadow. And then finally, if you really want to get a bit creative, I did this shoot years ago for a Wigtown Book Festival. This is children's author Debbie Gliori, and she'd written a book called The Tobermory Cat. And one of the things about, I know it's spoiler alert here, the Tobermory cat is this cat that walks around the island of Tobermory, which is, the town of Tobermory, which is on the island of Mull, on the Inner Hebrides of the west coast of Scotland. And there was a particular ginger cat that used to sort of wander around there. It didn't actually have an owner, but was sort of known to the locals. And different stories grew up about it. Debbie heard about this, wrote a book called The Tobermory Cat. Other people had done similar things. I think somebody had a blog at one point to do with the local cat, and but for this picture, what we decided to do was I took 2 photos. I took a photo of Debbie sitting there, as you see her now, but she also had a headset with some cat ears, and she had a fiddle. And this was the point, was that at the end of the story here, this is a spoiler alert, at the end of the story, what you find is that the Tobermory cat is also moonlights as the cat in The Cat and the Fiddle. So the famous children's nursery rhyme, "Hey diddle diddle, the cat and the fiddle, the cow jumps over the moon." So the cat and the fiddle. So I took another photo of her where she stood there with the fiddle out and the cat ears on, and cast this shadow here on the left. So, and then I combined the two in Photoshop. So it looks like here she is reading the book, and it's casting the shadow of the cat and the fiddle. And the tail, I added in afterwards because she didn't actually have a tail with her. So that's kind of what I wanted to show you. I'm hoping that gives you some ideas to play with these notions of shadows. There's a huge area of creativity to be had, and if you are prepared to start playing with your light source and playing with what you can do, there's so many stories and narratives and creativity. And so this is the kind of thing that I want to see for the challenge next week. Now I can see a few words of a few more comments have come in, so let's take a little look, see what people have been saying. Okay, looks like Jack was having problems seeing the video. Again, it seems to be sort of fairly local. I don't know, I'm still kind of okay here. Other people are saying it's fine. Oh, Rosemary said, yes, Jack, I had to close out and reload the page. I was having volume issues, and that worked for me. This rings a bell, actually. I think this has happened for other people before. If you suddenly find that the thing is frozen up or whatever, or it's stuttering, just refresh the page, and that seems to sort it out for most people. What else have we got here? Oh, Viji's arrived, says good evening, everyone. Max here says, sorry he's late. Also wondering what's up with the volume. Hopefully the volume, well, again, I'm hoping it's fine with everybody else. Jim saying YouTube sound and volume are fine here. And okay, so little bits of refreshing and various comments there. Hopefully that's got sorted out for everyone. Viji loves the shadows of forks. Tines. Oh yes, tines. Yes, instead of prongs. Time. That's a good word. It's not one I've used so much, but yes, it's the fork, the prongs, the tines. I like that. Yes, thank you. Ben also says tines. So a few more people talking about losing video and refreshing. Vandana says, who knew forks could dance? Yes, okay, so little bits and pieces. Where are we going? Rosie says, sorry, lost you for a while. Video chat came through from my son who's working in Cyprus. Oh, happy parents. Well, obviously, video chat from your son is probably going to take priority over watching me. Right. Oh, what is Meg? Oh, Meg's saying, can you do it with a cup of tea or coffee in a shadow? You absolutely can. You can, but because the generally speaking, the mug isn't glass, you wouldn't see through it. Well, coffee. Because Meg has a glass latte glass, nice triangular. You could certainly put light through that, and it would cast a shadow with an interesting light going through it. If it had the coffee in it, though, it probably wouldn't, because I think the coffee would be too thick. It would just create a black shadow. Could still be interesting, though. Certainly worth playing with. Okay, and all right, Jim says clever cat shadow. Rosie likes the cat shadow too. So does Viji. And Rosemary says, oh, I'm excited to see what clever things people come up with. Thanks for being so creative with the prompts. Excellent. Good. Really pleased with that. So I will remind you again at the end of this about the fact that we're going to challenge for next week, but to just run on the back of this, hopefully I've given you a few ideas here. So the notion then for the challenge is a cast shadow. So it's not about, I don't just want to see sort of like a picture of somebody's face that's lost in shadow, because that's the shadow on the person or the subject itself, and I'm not looking for silhouettes unless they are casting a shadow. Really is about the shadow being cast onto a separate surface. That's what I want to see, and that's where I think for this particular challenge the fun and the creativity is going to come into it. Now, the other thing to remember about shadows, which I should probably have said, which is to do with the size of the light source. I've talked about this before, but it's worth repeating, and certainly for anybody who's not been here through previous podcasts, is the size of the light source affects the hardness of the shadow. The larger the light source, now, okay, sorry, just noticed my thing pausing there for a moment. Still says I've got an excellent connection, so I don't quite know what's going on here. However, I'll push on through and hope everything stays okay. But basically, the larger the light source, the softer the shadow. The smaller the light source, the harder the shadow. So if you think about sunlight, whilst of course the sun is a million times bigger than the earth, if you look at the sun, if you hold your finger up at arm's length, the sun is actually only the size of the fingernail on your little finger. You can actually blot out the sun with your arm at arm's length by your little fingernail. Try it next time if you don't believe me. The sun is really that small. And so the sun creates a very, very hard shadow. By contrast, if you think of a large window where without the sun coming directly in, but maybe on a dull day, or if it's a north-facing window, you tend to get a very soft shadow. So the shadow that falls on someone, it's not harsh at all. It's rather soft and milky. And if you're outdoors on a dull day, when the whole sky is covered in clouds, you have virtually no shadow. And that's because essentially the cloud cover acts like a giant diffuser, and the whole sky becomes the light source. And so the light is essentially coming at you from all directions at the same time. And therefore, you end up with sort of very little shadow at all. You might get some shadow like under a car or under a shelf or something like that, because the light source is above, but mostly it's kind of all around and you don't really get much shadow at all. So understand then that the size of the light source is also powerfully affecting the shadow. So at the moment, if you look at the general shadow on me, there's light sort of bouncing around the place. There is a sort of shadow on the wall slightly. I've got a light source over there that's a little bit bigger, but if I use that torch, wherever I put that torch, this is a slightly smaller one, and you can see over here it creates a slightly harder shadow. And if I stick a hand there, you can see the shadow is quite strong. But also bear in mind the distance of the light source. As the light source gets closer, it sort of expands out. As it gets distant, it gets larger, and so essentially you can see here that the shadow gets quite soft. So play around. This is the real thing. The whole point of understanding photography with Kim Ayres is to expand your knowledge and your understanding of photography, and that means understanding and expanding your knowledge of light. And I don't think you can do much better than that, than playing with shadows. Some of you will read my blog, kimayres.blogspot.com, and my blog is called Painting with Shadows. And I tend to feel that shadows are one of the most important things to learn about lighting. We tend to think of photography as being about light, and if you know about light and you understand light, that's good. But if you understand shadows, you have to understand light even more. I think by understanding shadows, you gain a deeper sense of what light is. Shadows are where the interest happens, and because the brain, when your brain looks at a picture where something's lost in shadow, you kind of start, you can't help but get more engaged as you try and work out the puzzle of what the shadow is. Understanding shadows is also a key way to creating more interesting photos that then become more engaging to people who are looking at them. And that doesn't matter whether, that's true whether you're wanting to go into the competitions or the online scrolling, or you're wanting to put it into your just social media feeds and get a little bit more response and a few more likes. So next week then, the shadow challenge. I want you to take your photos, just one each. And for those of you who belong to the Facebook group, place your photo into the Facebook group, Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres. Those who don't do Facebook, email it to me. And tell me the story. Tell me what the shadow is. Tell me why you decided to take that photo, and then we will take a look at them all next week. I'll remind you again at the end of this podcast. Right, so It's a quick reminder then that if you are finding these useful or entertaining and you would like to sort of help support these podcasts in any way, buymeacoffee.com/Kim Ayres is a place to do it. The other thing to do, invite your friends and make sure you subscribe as well. Another thing, actually tomorrow's blog, kimayres.blogspot.com, I will be writing about a bit more about the challenge for next week as well. So some of the ideas I've been talking about this evening will get repeated on that. So that's a place to go and check and get some extra idea, scribble down some ideas from as well. Okay, go on. Nurije says she's looking forward to this challenge. Excellent. Cool. Right. So now what we're going to do then is we're going to move on to the critique section. And the critique section, for those of you who are less certain, who are just joining us or are, who knows, watching one of the repeats, the critique section is all about your chance to get feedback on your images. It's always an extraordinarily difficult thing to get genuine feedback on our photos. We put them on social media, people either click like or they don't. They might tell us it's lovely, but we don't necessarily know whether they mean it or they're just being nice. So, how do you get genuine feedback that isn't just somebody saying, well, that's not that, being derogatory, they don't like it. That's what this part of the internet is about. The critique section on Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres podcast is all about the chance for you to ask questions and to get feedback on the images that you send in. Now this week we do have quite a few images that have come in, so I'm not going to spend vast amounts of time on any one of them. Sometimes when I've only had 2 or 3 images, I tend to turn over a lot more time to them. This evening I've got quite a few to get through, but hopefully I will do justice for each of them. So let me now work out what I'm doing next and come on to where are we going to start. We're going to start with Jim, I think, because Jim was the first person to shove something in last week. And Jim sent this photo and more, not that one, and this one, really. This was his edited version. And Jim said, "Hi Kim, this is my image from Port Patrick last weekend, putting in for critique. The sky was grey and not very interesting. This also made my image a bit dull, but after tweaking it a bit in affinity and adding a better sky, I think there is overall improvement. However, your critique would be very welcome, and I've included a copy of the original image." So the original image is this one. So now you've put in a sky here. The first thing I've noticed about this sky, Jim, is that actually the sky seems to have also overlapped here, so that the blue of the sky has now turned the white buildings up here blue, or some of them and not others. You can see it here that this one isn't, this one is. So it's not necessarily fitted in the way that you wanted it to. The other thing is that whilst you certainly this is a dull day, you've played with the contrast a bit and brightened it up. The sky to me doesn't look like it fits the scene. So, sorry, let's go here. Let me just open this in Photoshop, and I just kind of want to show you what I mean, Jim. So, so first of all, what you've done, fine, you go here, let's maybe get the brightness and contrast, play with the contrast a little bit, brighten it up a little bit, something like that. Or let's even maybe take it into camera raw filter, just where I can do a couple of quick, let's do auto, that sort of added a bit more colour into it, brighten it up a little bit of contrast, and there we end up with something like your edited photo, but with the wrong sky. Now what you did was you've gone and put in a blue sky with clouds, but given the fact that this is a dull day and that you don't have the natural shadow, the problem is with the blue sky implies sunshine, and we don't have any kind of sunshine shadows within this. So let me go up here a minute, and I'll just use there's a sky replacement tool in Photoshop. So I'm going to click on that for a moment, and what I want to do is, all right, here's one I was playing with earlier. Let's go back to this a minute and put in a blue sky. I'll just move this over here and show you what happens. Now, your sky isn't a million miles away from this. Well, okay, it wasn't blue, it was cloudy. So let's just shove in some clouds here. And yeah, it adds texture to the sky for sure, because the problem was it was just blank. But these look like sunny day clouds, and because the rest of this is fairly dull, it just doesn't really fit. And so what I would say you really want to think about here, and the other thing is, I mean, I've seen people do this kind of thing before as well, where they just shove in sunset photos straight away to make it look more dramatic. And whilst it might look a little bit more dramatic in the sky, again, it doesn't necessarily add to or work with the actual photo you've got. Now, in your case, because it is a dull day and it's a dull thing, this is really what I think you need to do. So straightforwardly, let's just click OK here. And I think really this is all you kind of need to do. You just needed some texture in the sky. The problem is with this is that there's no texture, so it just appears blank. You need texture in it, but you need a texture that's going to tie in with and match the mood and feel of the rest of the photo. And the blue sky just doesn't match, because the whole, even though you kind of brightened it up and created a bit more contrast, it wasn't a sunny day, and the blue sky would also give a slightly pale, the whole way the light would fall, the colour schemes would be different. So really, that's the key thing that I wanted to get across here, Jim, is that if you're going to replace the sky, and fair enough, you want to do that, but you have to replace the sky with something that's sympathetic to the picture. And on a dull overcast day, well, then get a really interesting textured cloudy sky. And at this point, you can then play with it, if you wanted. Let's just take this and quickly drop it into here. At that point, if you want, you can boost your contrast more, or you can add in your vignette. You can play around with your clarity slider and texture, and boost this a bit more and play with more contrast and muck around with, there's all sorts of things you can do with it. But you've now got the option to sort of add more. That extra texture in the sky is really what's allowing you to lift this photo to the next level, rather than just putting a kind of random blue sky in, which didn't really fit with the image. So I hope that makes sense. Thank you for sending that one in, Jim. Right, okay, so Jim says, never noticed the sky overlap with the buildings. Yeah, very easily missed that one. And Viji says the colour of the sky and the water are different colours as well. Rosie says, I really like the grey clouds. They really add to the image. Yeah, so it's always that little thing of the brain, when you're looking at something, notices when something isn't quite right. And when I looked at your edited version, it didn't quite look right. And it's all down to that notion of sympathetic. If you're swapping the sky has to be sympathetic with the rest of the background. And there's nothing wrong with actually having a cloudy, overcast sky if you've got lots of texture in it. That can really add to the image as well. Right, okay. Excuse me. Okay, oh, Jim says thanks. We'll sort out the clouds. Excellent. Look forward to see what you put in there instead. So Viji next, I think. So Viji put in these slippers, sandals, flip-flops, and I think they're pretty much called flip-flops where I am. So Viji says, beach, sand, paw prints and slippers. This is a still image. I wanted to show some kind of action. Like, all you have to do is slip on those slippers and walk. Hence I placed them in a narrow frame. The nearer one is sharper, the distant one blurry, and has space in front to create that illusion. Please comment if I succeeded or failed and how better this could be composition-wise and also cropping. Have I zoomed in too much? Okay, so this one here, I'm not going to sort of set about editing it, but I think what we're talking about here is the concept side of it. Conceptually, your idea is a really nice one, I think. So you've got this idea of the kind of shoes, slippers, flip-flops that you wear on a beach. We can see the sand beneath, we can see paw prints. So that notion that, as you say, just step into them and go. I think, though, if you wanted to really take that story and make that story more effective, what would have worked better would have been to have got lower down and looked deeper into it. Part of the problem here, although you're not looking straight down, there's not, I don't tend to feel there's enough of the beach in this to give a sense of that's where you're going. If you're wanting to have that sense of we could now walk down the length of the beach like this, imagine that you came down, that you dropped right down almost to, not necessarily so you're resting the camera directly on the sand, but maybe only about 6 inches, a foot at the most, 15, 20 centimetres above the level of the beach. And then you're kind of looking, you've got the sand shoes, and you're then looking far down the length of the beach to the point whereby you actually have an horizon on a distance. Now, you maybe don't need much of a sky, but the horizon will be fairly near the top, but you would see a horizon. Now, if you can then line that up with either some footprints or paw prints that are sort of running off ahead of where you put the sandals, then I think you would be able to use those paw prints to sort of lead your eye into it. As such, at that point, you then have that sense you've got the slippers in the foreground, and you've got then where you can go with it. You've got that heading off into the distance. And so for the story that you're trying to tell, I think actually being able to see where you could go with that, that's what's really going to tell your story. The problem with this is it's just we're looking down at it, and whilst one is in front of the other, I don't think it necessarily gives you that stronger sense of anticipation of the journey about to begin as such, which actually being able to see where the journey is going to take you would. So hope that makes sense, Viji. Thank you for sending that one in. Right, what have we got here? A couple more. Oh, Max says, just one thing, can you sort out the ripple in your wallpaper behind you? I take it you're talking about that. And no, sorry, Mac, you're just going to have to get used to it. It's been here since we moved in. To be honest, I don't fully trust the plasterboard behind here. I think if I was to start, but it's kind of, if I tried to do that, I would actually have to strip everything off and start all over again, and I'm not. I'm not going to bother. So no, I'm afraid you're going to have to get used to it. Right, okay. Oh, Maria Garcia is here, says, I'm out of my league. What on earth makes you think you're out of your league? Send in your images. Be a part of this, Maria. Rosemary says she loves the concept, and she also loves the point about seeing where you would go, where you'd get to go in the sandals. Okay, Viji says she's getting it, and those toe grips look painful. Viji says, Jim. Right, okay, so where are we? Right, okay, Rosemary, let's move on to you then. And what have we got? We've got, so Rosemary's owls. So let me find that picture and let's flip over here. So Rosemary says, there's a trio of barred owls hatched this spring in the woods in our property, which is really exciting. This is a photo from one of the first sightings I had of them. Initially, they tended to hang out in a group, safety in numbers, and in the most cluttered backlit canopy they could find. Thankfully, as they matured, they gained a little bit of confidence to venture towards the edge of the wood where the lighting is much better. At the same time, they also became more comfortable with us being nearby and presented us with some really fun photo opportunities. I really wish I could share the excitement of this with all of you. But my main question is about the colour cast. You will see the green tint on the white of the forward owlet in the edited photo. And here's the forward. And just for those who hadn't noticed yet, there's the couple more at the back. So I'm sure there will be some of you who only noticed the front one. Certainly I noticed the front one. It took me a little while before I noticed the ones behind as well. So we've got a green tint on here, and you go on, the light filtering through the leaves comes through as green, and any owl shots from deep in the woods have this same green cast. My attempts to neutralise it have come out terrible, looking unnaturally whitened, and often make the leaves look very strangely coloured as well. The same green colour cast appears on all the photos I've taken of the owls as youngsters. I would love to know how to address it so that I can clean up the lot of them. Right, okay. Now, in essence here, first of all, there's the point that, well, they're on a branch, they're in under green leaves, there's going to be a naturally green cast anyway. However, what you're talking about is that the green just feels a bit too green, a bit too much there. Is there a way of bringing it back a bit? And in essence, what I think we're talking about here is to do with white balance. What I'm going to do here is let's just open this in Photoshop. And okay, let's just close Jim's picture here. And what I want to talk about is okay, let me just show you, quite often the easiest thing, depending on the program you've got, some of these have autocorrect things, and very often it's worth starting with the autocorrect. I'll just duplicate that layer here, and if I go to image auto tone, no, that's not making a lot of difference. If I go image auto contrast, again contrast, image auto color, oh, now suddenly these green, this now is standing out much more. That green cast has kind of gone and it's looking a little bit more naturally white. So what's happened here? What's it done? We still got green and we've got a yellow, and it looks a bit more natural. And part of the problem, some cameras, their default settings, quite often their white balance works in some areas and doesn't necessarily work in others. And one of the things you're using a Nikon, I think, and I do tend to notice quite often people using Nikons on auto white balance settings. Very often there's a kind of a blue shift to the greens. There's a kind of a deeper, richer, darker green. And sometimes you just need a slight nudge into the yellow. But let me show you, okay, and let's do it another way here. I'm going to duplicate that layer again. Let me go into Camera Raw Filter, where I can show you a little bit more about, here we get the white balance. Over here on the right here, it says white balance as shot. And again, if I do auto, we find that it's shifted. It's shifted here, the green to the purple. So we have two sliders here. We've got a temperature, the temperature thing, which moves from blue, which makes things a lot colder, yellow, which makes things warmer. Now, if we nudge it yellow slightly, that warms up the leaves a bit, but we still, the owl is lost in it. But then there's the tint. Let's just go back, take that back to 0. We've got a purple and a green tint. Now, if I take the green, it gets even more green. If I take the purple, now eventually it kind of gets purple, but you can see that we can go quite a way into it before it starts looking too unnatural. And in essence, what's happened here is we can nudge that purple this way a little bit, and now we are kind of neutralizing those greens. Let's just brighten that up a little bit. So you can see it's gone from that to that, and that kind of offsets it a bit. And if I go back to that auto, yeah, you can see this has gone plus 25 on the purple. Failing that, if you don't have Camera Raw, quite often there's you might have a color balance thing here. Here I've got a color balance, and in the midtones there's a cyan red slider, there's a yellow blue slider, but there's also a magenta green slider. And if I nudge this over into the magenta a bit, again we just kind of, it's doing that same thing, a little bit of sort of slightly more purple. Let's just brighten this up a little bit as well, because this is quite dark, so we'll just brighten that up. But do you see then that with this, by just shifting it over into, we've now kind of, the purple being the opposite of the green, has allowed that green cast on the to sort of disappear a bit more. And it also allows, because it's not gone too far, if we take it too far, then obviously all the leaves become purple and we lose what we've got. So you've got to play around a little bit, find the subtlety. There's a middle ground somewhere where you can get it, where it's now allowing the owl to stand out that much more against the green of the background, but before the green starts looking too kind of distorted. So that's just a very quick thing. You would maybe want to play around and fiddle around in with the shadows or the highlights as well. But hopefully then that gives you... So really the ultimate answer, Rosemary, here is it's one of white balance. And depending on what software you're using, there are all sorts of options around. Most slightly more sophisticated picture editing software will have a white balance auto option. Hit that first. Very often that solves your problems. If it doesn't, it might still give you a clue as to which direction to go. But quite often, if something's too blue, shift it towards yellow. If it's too yellow, shift it towards blue. If it's too green, shift it towards purple. And that tends to be where you're going to find your balance to get that white right. So I hope that was useful. I hope that kind of answers your question with that. So let's close that. So what have we got here? Oh, Rosie says, fabulous owlets, well caught. Rosie. Nurije says, such a shame about the colour, otherwise it's a great shot. Mac loves the owlet shot. Vandana thinks they're so cute. Mac also says, spot on with the white balance in Nikon, Kim. Nikon. Yeah, I actually had a similar problem, or slightly different problem with Fuji. I used to have a Fujifilm bridge camera, and what I found was whenever I went into the woods, the greens just felt bleh. They never felt very rich. And actually, they needed a sort of nudge up into the yellow. And quite often what I found was when I was in the woods, rather than using the auto white balance, there was an option for me to have the white balance as shady or clouded or something like that. And then suddenly the greens would come out in the way that I wanted them. So the auto white balance doesn't always do what you want it to. And learning about the white balance is something that can be quite interesting for doing that kind of color shift. So if you know what you're doing, you can do an awful lot in camera. If you don't, if you don't have time for that, you're just taking shots straight away, you've got it on auto. Where I've just shown you that kind of purple to green or blue to yellow, those are the places to do the color shifts to even it out in post-production. Maria says she loves the owls. Rosemary says that helps. I hadn't fiddled with the midtones, only the highlights. Your edit's much better. Okay, well, I'm glad that works. Oh, Meg says the barn owls are really nice and calm, beautiful to watch. Right, okay. Okay, well, Rosemary says, I usually leave my white balance on daylight, so cloudy would be a good thing to try too. So certainly if you're in the shade, in the shadows, then yes, there's going to be a colour shift on that. Okay, and Nurije would love to meet the owls as well. Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty rare thing to have the owls, a fantastic opportunity. Cool, right, okay. So, that's owls and white balance. So where are we going next then? Anne. Okay, let's go to Anne's picture. So let's find that. Let's go to here. Flip across. So Anne's done this in black and white, although she has also sent the colour original as well here, which seems to be flipped in reverse as well. Anne says, I took this photo in the far northwest Arizona on the Navajo reservation. The light was very harsh. I converted the photo to black and white and kind of liked the result. Any suggestions on how to edit the colour version to highlight the colours? Or is the black and white the best way to minimise the harsh light in this photo? Okay, well, I don't know that the black and white is necessarily doing you any favours. I mean, there's some interesting textures in there for sure. I think the colour one has the potential, and I think really, basically, it just needs... Let me just show you here. If we look at the levels, I won't take the levels here. Then over on the right here, you can see the histogram, and there's a big gap here where basically it means that everything's sort of sitting up in the dark, and we've not reached the light. And if I take this and I just drag this up here, we lighten up, and all the colours start to become a little bit richer. And then likewise, there's a little bit of a gap here over on in the dark, so I drag that down a little bit as well. And now all I'm doing is taking it to the edge. So at this point, we've still not lost anything in the highlights and we've not lost anything in the shadows. But we've gone from something quite flat to now something standing out a little bit more. So first thing to do, check your levels. By and large, that will make a little bit of a difference. You could also likewise play with curves. When I take that out, shoving an S curve into your curves. Here where you sort of drag the upper bit up towards here, take the lower bit down here. That tends to create a lot more contrast. If you're not careful though, you can kind of end up blowing your highlights and losing stuff in the shadows. You see, put them both together and it's well and truly overcooked. Maybe we could just nudge that a little bit here, and you kind of decide how far it is until you get it. And I think it's really pretty much as straightforward as that. However, what I would say with this, Anne, is Now, I've never been to Arizona. The only bits I've seen, Arizona, Colorado, all the places you went trotting off with Robert on your road trip, I've seen in films, I've seen in westerns. It always looks absolutely amazing, and I would absolutely love to go there. One of the things I feel though about this, my understanding from watching the movies is that this would be huge. However, I have absolutely no sense of scale whatsoever with this. I really don't know how big this is. I'm assuming it's huge because of the movies I've seen, but if I hadn't seen those movies, I wouldn't know. And I think there's a problematic thing here that we don't have anything to set it off against. This could be very mountainous going up with this huge rock that's sticking out the top. That could be several hundred feet high. Or it might just be a small pile of rubble with a large stone sticking out the top of it, and it might be no more than about 2 or 3 feet high. And there isn't really anything to give us a sense of it, I think. And I think really this is something, two ways you could go about this that immediately leap to mind. One is you need either a figure of some kind in the foreground. So if we had, if you'd included Robert, and Robert was standing here, or even he clambered up and he was standing here. I don't know how far it is, but the thing is that if you had a person standing in it, then that would give you a sense of scale, and you would need to have their feet in it. They would need to be partially moving up towards it to give us a sense of, are they in the foreground? Are they tiny, even though they're in the foreground, which makes the background look even bigger? Have they got quite close up to it? Is Robert taking up half the size of that, or is Robert just now a tiny little dot on the horizon? We have absolutely no idea. The other way of doing it is to include some other kind of background. Part of the problem here is that you're down at ground level, road level, and you're looking up, and we've just got clear blue sky. If you were further back, even better, if you were up on the side of a cliff or up on top of a hill looking down and up, then we would have a horizon line in the background, and I think some kind of horizon line, and at that point we might see other stacks of rocks like this, in which case how they appear on the horizon and further back would give us a much, much better sense of scale. And at that point then I think the whole picture becomes far more dramatic. So really it's quite apart from the light, which we've played around with, I think your real thing here, Anne, is that you want, if you're trying to get across the drama and impact of this rock, is we need a sense of scale. And that scale is either going to come from a person or it's going to come from the landscape that it's in. So hope that helps. And it sort of gives you a couple of ideas for, I'm imagining you and Robert would have probably taken many thousands of photos while you're out. Take a look through your folder, see what else you can find, whether you've got any other interesting ones there. Right, okay, so Nurije says beautiful Arizona. Jim says levels are always my first stop when editing too. Right, okay, Robert says it's probably 800 feet tall. Right, and that's huge, but I wouldn't know. You could just as easily be standing next to it and it could be hip height, So that's kind of interesting. Okay, Maria says, thank you for the invite to the podcast, Kim. Wonderful information. I love the feedback from the participants. Heading out as I'm just off to my hour-plus commute home. Ciao to all until next week. Well, thank you very much for turning up, Maria. These are recorded, so, when you get home a bit later, tune in, watch the rest of it, and hopefully come back next week. Right, okay, so thank you for that, and let's move on then to Jack. So Jack sent in this photo and said, I was trying to capture how fall ends, fall being autumn for those on this side of the pond. Beauty in weeds. Also, I wonder whether it's maybe a bit too light. And then in the comments, he put in a slightly different version, where he put this one and said, is this any better? And I have to say straight away, the answer to that second question is no, I don't think it is. I think actually this is almost going in the opposite direction to what we just talked about, the owls. This is where there's a kind of blue-green shift, which is actually taking it away. And when you come back to this, much slightly more natural colour I think this automatically works well for you. In terms of being too light, no, I don't think it's too light. You've got what's really nice about this, Jack, is that you've got a backlight. And one of the things I've talked about very often in these podcasts, and will no doubt talk about again, is backlight is a kind of photographer's secret weapon. Everything becomes that little bit more magical. When you've got a light that's coming from behind something but isn't actually in the picture, then it helps separate it from the background. You've also managed to separate it from the background by using a shallow depth of field, by having a wide aperture. That's really good. And then that lightness, that light, so we've got texture in the background, but the texture is adding to the picture, but it isn't detracting from it. So that's rather nice. Actually, my only sort of real criticism with this would be, I think it's too centered. It just sort of sits in the middle. And I think if this was square, maybe you could get away with a square crop. That might possibly work. But actually, I probably would. This is one of those situations where it would work slightly better. A rule of thirds. I think you need it off center. So what I'll do here is we'll go to the crop option here. Yeah, I'll make sure the content aware is cropped here just for when I want to come to it. But first of all, let's just show you if we were to make that roughly, where are we? 13, I need it. Give or take a bit. That's square, I think. And even then, you don't want it absolute dead center. Maybe something like that. I think, yeah, that's not bad. And at that point, I think you could add in a vignette. So let's take the optics here, add in a vignette, which sort of draws in a little bit more. And if you wanted, you could even sort of boost the texture or the clarity a little bit, just to kind of make the sharpness of those sort of dying leaves stand out a little bit more. So, you know, and I think something like that will work. However, I also think if we sort of pop back here, that really, if we were to take this and then sort of move it this way a little bit, move it so that this was sort of on the rule of thirds. We'll go back to content aware here, into that. And you see that actually by having it off center, I think it makes it slightly more interesting. You want to be off center so that the plant is more on the right than on the left, because it's already leaning. There's a slight diagonal that comes in, so it looks like it's heading to the left of the picture. I think you want to have space in front of it, which feels like having more space on the left than on the right. And at this point, you could then also cancel that. Just duplicate that that layer, and then if I do the same effect before, where you just kind of pull it in a little bit. So I mean, that's an idea to play with. But by and large, I mean, I think I think you're onto something. You know, there's some beautiful textures in here, Jack. You've got these lovely spikes, that old the past it withered thing, but you've still got beautiful texture. And then you've got a lovely backlight, and you've got a really nice your use of aperture to create a shallow depth of focus works. And I think the color scheme works. I think your adjusted color, where you sort of shoved it into the blue greens, was overkill, wasn't doing it any favors. The main thing about this, I think, is the crop. And I think you either kind of slightly wider, you go and make it a kind of move this to the right, so you've got a kind of rule of thirds type thing, or you come in a bit closer, make a square crop, and that will probably work quite well in some of these online things like Guru Shots and Photo Crowd, especially if it's one of these where people are looking at them on their phone, or an Instagram photo as well. So, hope that helps there, Jack. Okay, so where are we at? Oh, Pat says she loves this. Rosemary says, I love the contrast to the weed. It really props. The original green background is more natural and a better contrast, I think. And Jack says, thank you so much. Excellent. Good. So let's move on now. Right, where are we at? So Nurije. Now, Nurije sent in this picture and said, this is out of my comfort zone, but I thought I'd give it a go. I love the meaning in the heart-shaped sign, which says, life is like a camera. Focus on what's important, capture the good times, develop from the negatives, and if things don't work out, take another shot. So Nurije goes on to say, my mother-in-law gave it to me as part of a birthday present. I've been meaning to take a photo of it for quite a while, so I finally did. So what Nurije's done is essentially create a still life. Still life, she's got that heart-shaped thing, plaque with the writing on it. She's put a camera there. She's got a photo print card sitting here, and she's surrounded it by little fairy lights. She goes on to say, while I've done it, I'm not fully happy with it. I feel like something's missing, so I converted it into black and white. Here are both images. Now, I suppose the question is really, I mean, in terms of composition, I think still life is one of these things that you have to play with. You play around with until you feel that it looks right. But in terms of colour or whatever, I feel the colour works much better than the black and white. Now, it's a little bit dark, this. I would, again, be tempted to... Is this going to... Okay, it looks like the right click on my mouse is really playing up. It's getting worse each week. It's a matter of time before I'm going to have to change my mouse, I think. Again, I feel this will probably lighten up a little bit. Yep, and there, sure enough, if we can kind of nudge that a little bit, create a little bit more light into here. Be slightly careful. We're now blowing the highlights on the, in which case maybe just using the mask, we could just pop round and just darken down the tips of those lights so that they're not completely blown. But the thing is that when we compare this to the black and white, the reason I think the colour works better is because there's a warmth to it. You put the fairy lights in and you put in yellow fairy lights as opposed to kind of that bluey white. So you've created an extra layer of warmth. And then that layer of warmth is being reflected in the metal in the camera. And it's creating a very kind of cosy feel, almost a kind of Christmassy feel to it. So it feels like, yeah, like a kind of almost festive, cosy, celebration, present. It's got that feel of a gift as such. When you go into the black and white, now the black and white creates interesting textures and creates a certain nostalgia and artiness to it, and that's fine. But what happens then is that these fairy lights become completely redundant. They're no longer contributing a warmth. All they're doing is creating a whole bunch of little white dots around, which are grabbing our attention but failing to fulfill. They're not really giving us a sense of why they're there. Whereas when we're in the colour, we're very aware of why they're there, but they're creating this warm, rich, cosy light. But in here, they're just kind of, you know, I think if you were going to do a photo black and white like that, you'd be better off actually removing the fairy lights and just using another light source, maybe just a window light, having a soft window light coming onto it would create all the light and shadow that you need. You don't need the fairy lights. The fairy lights now just feel kind of redundant and getting in the way at this point. So I hope that kind of makes sense, Nurije, that I think that use of, if you want to have the fairy lights in, then I think you have it in colour, because that's really what's making it work for you. So I hope that makes sense anyway. Well, another comment here. No, there isn't. Okay, maybe there's more comments to come. As always, I am a few seconds ahead. I do something and then my counterpart on the screen over there sort of reacts about 10 seconds later. And then if you're typing something out, by the time you've typed it and then I've written, yeah. So I'm about 30 seconds behind or in front of. Anyway, not to worry too much about that. Jim says, I like the colour version best. Jack says, I've learnt so much. Thank you. Excellent. Glad of that, Jack. And Nurije says, it makes sense. Thank you. Good. Excellent. So let's move on then. Let's go to Vandana. And Vandana says, so it was sunrise and not sunset. So Vandana says, took this on the way to work. Sun was coming up. This was slightly edited, and she also sent in the original. This is the original. Oh, sorry. Let's go back. Of course, I forgot to do that. So this is Vandana's picture. Taken on the way to work. Sun just coming up. So she's caught the light through the tree. And this is the original photo. and wondering what she might have done to improve it. And I think, to be honest, what we have here is what's grabbed your attention for certain is the fact that you've got the light coming through the tree, and then because it's sort of partially obscured by it, we're getting these sunbeams kicking out, and that's quite fun. But I was quite intrigued by your original, because what it means you've cropped in here, because when I look at the original, I find what I really like. I really like these reflections over here on the windows. I think that the reflection of the sunrise on the windows here becomes a really important part of that narrative. If you're talking about that early morning feel and the light really just low on the horizon. Now, at the moment, with the way you've taken it, the tree is sitting smack bang in the middle, and what you did was you cropped in to make it a kind of square crop. But I think if we were to crop it slightly differently, so let's just close Jack's one there and close Nurije's. So, and I think if we were to put it in here and then actually make more of that, we can then sort of crop that in here. We can pull this down to something like this, maybe pull that in a little bit further. Have your sun on this kind of rule of thirds line, you know, about a third of the way into the picture. And then I think we've got a slightly more interesting picture. The sun is here, it's doing everything we want the sun to do, but we've also added in an extra part of the story. We've enhanced the narrative because we've got that sun reflecting rather beautifully off these windows over here. And then also what happens is it creates more of this sense of depth to the picture as well, because we've now got the buildings doing that perspective line running down, just as the trees are and the paving that's going into it. So then if we take this and you could just very briefly play around, again, maybe vignette it very slightly, just more concerned about putting it in on the left than the right. And play a little bit around with the clarity, something like that. You can even play around with the curves if you want to darken it down a bit, just exaggerate things slightly. And, I think at this point, so it's about that thing I keep talking about, which is what's the story? Now, the story was the sun, but there's a way to enhance that narrative. What other elements are around you which can add to that story? And I think at this point, getting in that row of buildings on the right with the sunlight reflecting in them, I think then really helps to enhance that narrative. So I hope that makes sense, Vandana. Thanks very much for sending that one in. So let's close that. And close that, and then flip back. So right, okay, so referring to the previous picture, Vandana thought it was a beautiful one with subtle colours. That was Nurije's photo. Rosie said, what a lovely mother-in-law you have. I prefer the colour version. As Kim says, it has a lovely warmth to it. Okay, so now we're on to the next one. Pat says it feels wrong to shoot straight at the sun. I think the thing with that, Pat, is generally speaking, yes, you do have, well, first of all, you have to be extraordinarily careful if you've got a camera and you're pointing it towards the sun, because the camera, the lens is a magnifying glass and it's going to magnify, and you can do some serious damage to your eyes. So you always have to be very, very careful. If you're pointing the camera at the sun, really you want to be doing it so that if you've got a screen in the back that you can look at, you look at the screen, you're not looking at it through the viewfinder. That's a really important point. The second thing, though, is that if you are photographing sunsets or sunrises, then obviously the sun becomes an important part of that. Obscuring it through a tree or creating a kind of silhouette effect or things like that can be quite a nice way of doing it. Having it just coming around the edge of a building, it sort of helps the outlines, adds a little bit more texture. So I think it's quite a fun way of doing something, and I think it was a good way to do that, Vandana. But absolutely, Pat, you're right in the sense that you do have to be extraordinarily careful about it. Oh, Rosemary says, I want a t-shirt that says, what's the story? Yeah, I think it's a bit like Russ was going on the other week about the give it room to breathe, which is another one of the ones that I quite often find myself saying. Um, there are certain things that I'm going to repeat. Probably about half a dozen phrases that I would use an awful lot, like straighten the horizon. um, and Rosemary likes the edit with the reflecting windows reflecting the sunrise. Ben says, can you damage your sensor by pointing the camera at the sun? Do it for long enough, probably. I think there's a little bit of debate on that. If you're using an SLR or DSLR, then actually what you've got to remember is that the sun isn't actually hitting your sensor until you go click. When you go click, what's happening is the light is coming through the lens, hitting a mirror, which is coming up and then going through the viewfinder. So that's why you're able to see through the lens, because you're using it like it's bouncing off mirrors. It also means that the light is going directly into your eyes. And then when you click, as it opens up the shutter to let the light in, the mirror moves up for the light to hit the sensor. So it's only hitting the sensor for as long as you have the shutter open. If you are doing a fast shutter speed, which you probably are if you're pointing it at the sun, then it's probably not really likely to have too much of a problem. But if you've got a slow shutter speed, if your shutter speed is too slow, so I mean, it's not good practice anyway, because the picture would white out. So you would have an unusable photo. And I think if you did that a lot, there probably is a good chance that the sun might start. If you're constantly taking photos of the sun and you're constantly overexposing, chances are you're not going to be doing your sensor any good. Probably, but to be honest, I would say maybe Google that. You'll probably find there are articles written specifically about it. It might also vary depending on the camera you've got as well. But I think generally speaking, you're probably fine if you're just periodically taking photos which are not overexposed of sunrises and sunsets. Okay, and Vandana comes back and says, looks really good with the crop. Thank you. Excellent. Good. Glad that one worked. Okay, so now what we're going to do is going to move on to Robert. And Robert and the shopping cart. So Robert says, I took these photos, which is this one and this one, in the Animas River in Durango, Colorado last Tuesday. I took a still and then I took a long exposure. The cart was moving slightly in the river and the bridge was also moving a little bit. But I was able to lock the camera onto the bridge, pointing it down so it was not moving. It was a golden hour photo and I didn't think I had much time to find a better subject. Robert, are you really going to tell me that in a golden hour light in Colorado, the only subject that you could think to find was a shopping trolley in the water? Now, fine, you've got a shopping trolley in the water, but I refuse to believe it was the best golden hour subject you could get, because it's not even obvious that this was taken at the golden hour. So I'm questioning you on that one. However, let's get back to this. We're forgetting the golden hour bit. Let me know what you think and how I could have improved it. I'm not sure which one I like better. Okay, couple of things for first thought. Well, first thing with this one, first of all, I'll talk about technical and then I'll talk about story. On a technical level, even though you managed to fix the camera firmly to the bridge, if you say the bridge was moving slightly and the thing was rocking slightly, the problem is this isn't really in focus. As we kind of come in, it's not sharp focus. Now, when you sent me the originals here, when I take a look at your information, ISO 100, f22, eighth of a second. So that eighth of a second is giving us that lovely blurry movement in the water, but it's also kind of created, it just meant that it needed to be steadier, because if you are creating something blurred like the movement of the water, you need something really sharp and still in order to create the contrast. Unless you're going completely abstract or semi-abstract, where it's just about the whole thing being blurred, which I don't think this is supposed to be. What you're trying to achieve here is that notion of the sharp stillness contrasting with the flow of the water. In which case, you've got to get those technicals a bit more right. Now, fine, actually, I think probably your technicals of if you're actually solid and nothing else is moving is probably right. But if that bridge was moving a little bit and the trolley's rocking a little bit, you're up against it. And in that case, that's what you've had a problem with here. Now, your other picture, you actually have a different technical problem with. So let's just pull that out, and here we are. Because I was looking at this, and it's incredibly noisy. It is so noisy. I couldn't believe that it would be this noisy when you've got this amount of light, even if it is. So I looked at and what you've got here is you've got it on a 60th of a second, which should be plenty of, and f32, and then an ISO of 12,000. And I can only think here that what's happening, I'm not quite sure what you didn't need an f32. An f32 is giving you an incredibly narrow aperture, which is letting virtually no light in. And so your camera has had to compensate by whacking up the ISO to ridiculous levels. You could have got away with an f5.6 on this, or even an f6.3, and even an f8. But certainly I think actually, given the fact that it's a fairly flat surface, you're not looking down the length of the river. I think you could, so I think this is one of those cases where probably because you had it on a really narrow aperture to try and get the slow movement of the water, you forgot to change it before when doing the still image. I have fallen into this trap so many times. I mean, I'm not, don't feel like you're the only person in the world, or that I'm accusing you of being the only person in the world to do this. I raise the point because it's a point to be worth raised for absolutely everybody else who's listening and watching today, that if you are changing the kind of photo you're taking from slow shutter speed to fast shutter speed, you've got to remember to make sure that the other things, that your aperture and your ISO, are also being compensated for. Because otherwise we just adjust one and something else goes flying out. And because you had a really narrow aperture in order to limit the amount of light, so you could do a slow shutter speed for the other photo, for this one, it meant that when you swapped back, you kind of forgot to change the aperture, and consequently your ISO went over the top with that. So those are things I want to say on a technical level. The other thing is on a story level, I kind of feel I would like to see more of the context of the trolley. There's nothing to say that this is in Colorado. To be honest, this could quite easily be in Dumfries. That could be the River Nith. I'm sure I have seen shopping trolleys in the River Nith before now. It could probably be almost any urban environment with a shopping mall nearby in the world. So is there something about it that makes it distinctive to that town in Colorado? Is there something about it that makes it interesting in the place in the river? And I think I can't help but feel this is one of those where, rather than being on the bridge, if you got down onto the embankment and actually given us a sense of a bigger picture of the river, where we had a horizon line. So the horizon line is either showing us buildings in the background, or it's showing us the river as it's disappearing into the distance, or it's showing other objects that are sitting within the river. I think that would have then given it a much more interesting context. In essence, the story, the narrative of this is you've got the nature, and then you've got the out of place human object discarded into nature. So there's, if you like, nice ecological, political, socio-political narrative in there. I think if you want to ramp that narrative up, that's where you need a little bit more context. And if you can see then the urban skyline behind it, or you can see the river drifting, getting further away, but there's boats or other objects within it, or there's even another shopping trolley slightly to one side, or even that you get the bridge in it, and so that you can then see that here's the shopping trolley, and you can tell that it's just somebody's just thrown it off the side of the bridge. I think these things would really enhance that story. So, hope that gives you some ideas. Hope that kind of answers your question, both on the technical and the narrative side. So, thanks for sending that in, Robert. I hope that was useful. Right, okay, so where are we? And Okay, so right, so Vandana liked the crop I did. Rosie asks if the stabilisation was on or off for the shopping trolley, and Robert says ISO 12,000. I thought I set it back to 100. Back to Durango. Yes, you're going to have to go back and take another one. Oh, Pat's asking, was it dumped or was it an accident? Robert reckons it doesn't know. There's a lot of homeless people in the area. It probably dumped. I mean, I think it's difficult to think how a shopping trolley would accidentally end up in a river, even on a bridge. Most bridges have, you know, some kind of wall or gate, so chances are it's probably dumped. Robert says, I also failed to mention that I had 3 dogs tied to my waist, so I was limited due to that as well, and was moving about freely, taking better photos. Yep, okay, yeah, but blame the wife. I'm sure that one will go down well. I suppose there is a point here as well. I've said it before, worth saying again, just as a point, and I think it's a point true for everybody, which is that when you're creating the photo, whilst you may have the best excuses in the world, nobody cares. Well, we maybe care because we're trying to work out where something went wrong in critique. But when you're putting that photo out, other people are seeing that photo devoid of context. Nobody knows whether that photo was easy to take or difficult to take. Nobody knows whether you aged 10 years, lost £1 million, you know, whatever trials and traumas you might have gone through to get that photo, and all the reasons why it didn't quite work don't count for anything. People look at the photo and it works or it doesn't. The only time the story becomes part of it is either in a critique section like this, which is, you know, this is why it didn't work, what could I have done to help make it work better? Or sometimes there's really interesting backstories to photos, in which case you write a blog post about it. Or it's the kind of thing you sit in the pub. It's a bit like the fisherman's tales of the one that got away. Everybody's got tales of, you know, the fish that was absolutely huge, bigger than everything else. Nobody ever, you know, but they did have it, but it got away. How are you ever to know? Okay, Ben's come back in and says, opinion on the internet, woohoo, is that you can damage your sensor by pointing your camera at the sun. Less of a problem for DSLRs, as you said. Right, okay, fair enough. So be careful about what's photographing those sunrises and sunsets. Not only can you damage your eyes, you can also damage your sensor. So beware, be aware. So thanks for checking that one out, Ben. Cool, right, okay, so I think we are now coming on to the last photo, or the last pair of photos. Garry. So 2 quick things with Garry then. And Garry, let's find his first photo, because I will just talk very briefly about this one. Garry says, I've been given feedback on this image that I've crunched the blacks too harshly on the trunk of the tree. Is this just an aesthetic preference, or in general should we avoid total absence of details due to underexposure? Well, this one felt fairly straightforward to me to answer, which is, it's a silhouette. It's a silhouette of a tree. And if it's a silhouette, you're not expecting to see details. The whole point of a silhouette, and if you want, I don't know whether you saw the silhouette episode, Garry, certainly if you haven't, go to my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Kim Ayres, excuse me. Go back a few months and find the silhouette challenge and the week before, where I start talking more in depth about silhouettes. The whole point of a silhouette is that you are not seeing the details. The silhouette is all about the outlines and the patterns and the shapes, and that's precisely what this picture is. This picture is the tree, and it's the shape of the tree, and it's all those millions of little branches and twigs that are coming off. You wouldn't expect to see detail, because we can also tell that the sun is behind it because of the strong shadows coming forward. Now, if it was a picture of a tree that was fairly dark, but you were wanting the detail, if the bark, the rich texture of the bark was part of the narrative of that picture, then certainly you want to have that in it. But if you're doing a silhouette's a silhouette. So I wouldn't worry too much about it. I don't really understand why somebody feels that you've gone that way. They obviously had a different idea in their mind of what they wanted to get, what they would want out of that photo than you did. You've gone for silhouette. You haven't gone for detail in the of the texture of the bark. So yeah, I wouldn't worry too much about that one. Okay, next one is this, and I don't think I need to spend too long on this to be able to answer your question either, where you said, I like the shadow cast onto the umbrella, but the scene is spoiled for me by the man wearing the safety jacket in the background. Is there any way of addressing this? So what we've got here, sunset or sunrise, but anyway, very low sun in the sky, beautiful shadow getting cast onto the parasol, but we have this bloke here with the red bag, could be a postman, not sure, but yes, so it kind of one of those reflective yellowy jackets, and whilst he is part in shadow, is enough there to sort of draw the eye a little bit. And quite simply, I think what we need to do with this is just selectively either darken it or remove the colour. And I think it's really as straightforward as remove the colour. I mean, if I go to hue saturation, there's two ways you can do this. I can either literally desaturate like that. Let's take the paint bucket, refill it in like that, and then using the brush tool on the mask, I turn this to white, and then literally just paint over this so that the grey of the black and white desaturated bit is just covering the greens of that. And then I'll just swap that back to black and make sure we get that lovely little edging there back on that. So very roughly, very quickly, we do that, and you can instantly see it's gone. If you felt the red of the bag was also having the same problem of grabbing the attention, we could likewise just colour that back in like that. And now, having gone into the greys, it's not grabbing the attention in the same way. What we could also do even is we could take curves level, but in Photoshop we can do it, there's a little bit down here where we clip it to the hue saturation, and now if I drag that, I can darken or lighten, but it's only lightening the bit where we've done the bit on the layer below. So I could even just pull that down a little bit, darken it a bit more, something like that, and now this person is not just in black and white, but they're pretty much falling into line with the other people in the background as well. So basically, I think probably something as fairly straightforward as that. You can desaturate or desaturate and darken will do the job for you. Another option, if you just want to go straight forward with the hue saturation, is we go to, say, the greens and selectively, if I use the little pipette there, select that colour there, that shows us the range, and then I can desaturate that as well. Having said that though, it is taking out some of the other yellows up here, so again I might want to paint those back in on the mask just so that I've not lost those. Doing the same kind of job. But I hope that sorts that out for you, Gary, and answers that question. Right, okay. So, where are we at? Oh, April says, hi everyone, just dropping by to say hi, hope all is well. Left it late, but glad you could stick your head round the door anyway. Right, Nurije likes the tree in the shadow. Ben says, I like the way the texture grades from the top to the top of the picture. Oh, Pat's off. Glad you could make it for as long as you could, Pat. So Rosemary says the distraction disappears so we can focus on the lovely coloured shadow of the woman with the parasol. Lovely capture. And April says, I love this picture and the edit makes it even better. And Jim likes the edit too, must remember that one. And Rosie says, lovely image, Garry. Great, excellent. So that pretty much draws us towards the end of this this podcast. If you found it useful or interesting or entertaining, you would like to support it, buymeacoffee.com/Kim Ayres is the place to do it. Also, invite your friends. I'm sure you must know other photographers who you feel would be useful. Give them the link, point them to this YouTube page. And don't forget, we have all previous 75 episodes sitting here which people can dip in and out of as well. Right, so next week is the shadow challenge, and the shadows I'm looking for, not silhouettes, not face half lost in shadow, but the cast shadow, the shadow that falls on the wall or on some other kind of surface when you have a light source with it. And I want you to be creative with that. You have the option, you can include the subject and the shadow, or you might just decide to use the shadow itself, or you might decide to combine several different objects so that when combined and the light shines from a particular way, create a shadow that you wouldn't expect, create something quite different from what you would expect. It's a place to be really creative. Now, I know you've all got busy lives, and some of you will leave this to the last minute. A little bit. I was chatting away to somebody the other day. We were talking about who sort of occasionally enters the challenges, and was talking. It's a little bit like sort of sitting on a bus, doing your homework on the way to school, leaving it at the last moment, and going, wish I'd done this earlier in the week. I would say start thinking about it. Tomorrow, go check out my blog. I'll have written down some more of these ideas, and you refer to that. Google it. Type into Google Images. Creative shadows photography. Visit Pinterest, do things like that, see what people are doing and get some ideas, because I think this is one to have a go at, one to have fun with, one to get creative with, because everyone here who is watching this has a love for photography and wants to learn how to improve that photography, and really learning to play with shadows is going to teach you so much. There's only so much you can learn by sitting here watching me. You're going to learn an awful lot more by doing. So I think have a go at it. Stick your image in for next week's podcast. Either go to the Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres Facebook page and submit your image. Just the one each though. And or if you're not doing Facebook, email it to me. And like I say, let me know a little bit of, give a little bit of background, a little bit of story to it. Don't just put up a picture where we're all going, I wonder what that is, not really sure. Your idea here is to communicate. You're trying to get some kind of story across to us. You want us to be fascinated, engaged, curious, find it funny, find it sad, you're trying to evoke some kind of emotional or intellectual response in the viewer. Okay? But mostly you're here to have fun with it. So I really look forward to seeing what you're going to create. So that's us. Thank you ever so much for coming along. Last couple of comments, people are starting to say, have a good week, everyone, and good luck with the Shadow Challenge, everyone. Just to let you know, for those of you who, when I stop doing this, if you kind of leave and come back, you'll suddenly find you can't access any of these comments. It's while YouTube processes the video, you don't have access to the live chat comments. However, once it has processed it, which is usually sort of around mid to late morning tomorrow, you'll suddenly find that these chats are back. So if you are watching this afterwards, check the live chat replay and you can sort of watch the comments as they've been coming along. So that's us. Thank you ever so much to everybody who's turned up, to everybody who's submitted, to everybody who's taken comments, and I really look forward to seeing what you're going to put in for the Shadow Challenge next week. Take care. Bye-bye.